Hello and welcome to this podcast with me, Chris Fordham, for the Light Review. Today's setting for the podcast is the Boscolo Hotel in the south of France, which juxtaposes nicely with the products that we are looking at today with Matt Boyson, who makes wooden lights, amongst other things, and is very close to the arts and crafts movement, to my mind. Just the purity of the material he uses, it really shines through in the products that he makes. So sit back, have an espresso, and I sincerely hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Seeing such a sculptural range of wooden products from one supplier is quite rare, and their aesthetic is quite close to almost being an art form in itself. What was it that drove you to use this material in the first instance?
After years of being a builder, which followed being a photographer and having been through art college, I started around about 2001 making yurts. I'd done a lot of traveling and it was an answer to an idea I had at the time. That idea disappeared out the window, and I spent the next 18 years making and renting out yurts to people, which was interesting and really changed the way that I viewed wood as a material and gave me a whole raft of skills around steam bending that obviously hadn't come up when I was a builder. When I decided that I'd done my time as a yurt maker and I wanted to get into something that had more finesse and required a greater skill base so I could push myself a bit more, and also kept me out of the weather because my workshop had been under canvas for about 14 or 15 of the 18 years that I did it. I started to bring on the skills that I'd learned through the yurt making and brought them into the lamps that I was making now. So with my sculptural element lamps, the shadow lamps, all the steam bending very much reflects that period of history. With the other pieces that I'm making, the pendant lights and the downlight bezels, the tables, they're very much informed by how I learned to work when I was just going into the woods, cutting the trees myself, bringing them back, prepping them, getting them all ready, putting them through the whole process. When I began to fall in love with all of the inconsistencies in the materials, and rather than forcing the materials to be what I wanted them to be, I started to work towards their strengths and let the material lead the way. So pretty much all of my work now is really about the wood, making the wood come to the fore, allowing all of the little foibles that wood has, be it sporting through rot or olive ash, which is affected by a bacteria which changes the pattern of the grain within it. So that when you look at my work, hopefully you're taken a little bit by the physical form of it, but ultimately you're left just admiring the material it's made from.
I think that's an interesting point actually, because I'd actually thinking about it, our culture is very much about perfection, isn't it? I know everything has to be stark, clean, white walls and tiles and things. And if it's not, then obviously there's a design element to it. But I remember reading a book, I think it was called Light in Shadows, and they were talking about like the patina that Japanese sculpture and pottery and such like has, and they see that as a benefit. They see that as part of the product itself, and that speaks volumes really, because that's really the way we should be looking at it, shouldn't we? It's so in depth. I mean, your products are an example of that, aren't they?
I think so. I think we're all drawn towards symmetry, but I think there's also a thing about loving asymmetry. You can look at a perfectly symmetrical face and see the beauty of it, but personally, I think you're more likely to fall in love with a slightly asymmetrical face because it has character. And that's there in wood. Wood is exactly like people. It has a lifespan. That lifespan is full of experience. That experience might be two trees rubbing against each other. It might be a consistent wind direction which pushes the trees in a particular way. And when they grow, they respond to that, and they'll put grain on, or what appears as grain more on one side of the tree to support that tree. So when you mill it, that all comes out in it. If you have cankers, which create swirly patterns within the wood, that's really something that's grown on the tree that is unique to that tree. And a lot of what makes my work unusual or completely unique is just the choice of material for that particular piece.
That's amazing. I mean, I hate to say it, but I can see you just walking around a wood, just comparing trees and seeing what would give you the best results. And the story behind it is also really interesting because lots of people love. I mean, I think everyone is drawn towards nature in some aspects, and if you can express that through a product and explain why it is, it just gives. I mean, on a superficial level, it gives you a nice talking point, but on a more in-depth level, you can feel maybe that product is perhaps more sustainable as well. I mean, I was going to ask you actually, apart from where do you get your inspiration for your products, and you said really it's been a journey for you, hasn't it? It's been something that you just didn't fall into. I mean, I can't think of many builders that would be so in touch with their I can't remember which side of the brain it is, but their creative side. I don't know too many builders, but I just assume that they're generally less driven by aesthetics.
It depends. There are plenty out there. They tend to work making the nicer things that you see in people's homes. Or if you walk into a house and see that it's been particularly well finished, it's because somebody who did that work really cared. I've worked with plasterers that I wouldn't want to work with again, and I've worked with plasterers that I'm in awe of. So
Yeah.
they're there. As far as sourcing the wood, I get a percentage of my wood, quite a high percentage of my wood from trees that are felled almost exclusively locally as part of wood management schemes. I've just recently taken on about 3 tons of olive ash, which is ash which has been stained by a non-harmful bacteria. And that came about because half a dozen trees were being felled because they had ash dieback just beginning into them. They ran along the side of a field and they had to be taken out. So I went along to help a friend do that with a view to taking a small amount of ash from it, and then realized that this olive ash was side to side through all of the trees. And it was an extraordinary opportunity to get a lot of it in one go. So you bring the trees down, you do the work on that, you get somebody in to mill them on site, you take the wood away, you stack it up in the workshop, and you leave it for 2 years until it's air dried. And then prior to use, it goes into a drying room, which brings it down to a functional humidity, internal humidity. And that's all come about through wood that probably otherwise would have gone to firewood, but actually is really quite spectacular.
So that's where your sustainability and circular economy aspect comes in. I mean, is that a conscious decision, or is it just based on the fact that you get where you can? I mean, you're trying to, that's part of your makeup as a person and as a company, I guess.
Well, it comes a lot from making the yurts and spending all the time in the woodlands, cutting the trees. You get a love for the environment that the material comes from and not just the material itself, which is where I'm probably slightly different in how I approach things than somebody who's gone through a classical education in joinery or whatever it might be. But it's not just that. For example, I use sapele a fair bit at the moment because I picked up a dozen sapele internal doors for almost no money that would otherwise have gone to a skip. And I break those down. And they're quite a good example of the material defining what you can make from them, because obviously the dimensions of the material within a door is limited. They're 4 inches wide, 1.5 inches thick, or whatever it might be. So you can only make so much from them. But you have this wonderful mahogany wood, which would have just gone to a big bonfire in a field somewhere, because rather sadly, that's where a lot of the skipped wood in this country goes.
That's terrible. I mean, that saddens. That really does. I was hoping you weren't going to say that. I thought you were going to say something more romantic. But I mean, how can you burn that stuff? It's also probably you're making a rod for your own back for something, aren't you? Because I guess there would be easier ways of obtaining material, something that was pristine or a little
Well,
bit more managed. So I I guess that you advertise that fact when you're selling your
Hmm.
products. I guess people would buy into that. I hope that they would, because it's a very decent thing to be doing. And form follows function, as you said. I mean,
Yes.
I love the fact that you're being driven by the material qualities of what you find. I mean, it's a lovely story, definitely.
Well, there's more to it than that. Even I mean, like taking wood from a source, like using those doors. Yes, I've got to spend time prepping that wood up, but if I go to a local wood suppliers and get wood from them, I'm paying them to spend that time to get that wood ready. So the amount of money that I save, or the time that I'm spending on it, is money in my pocket, not somebody else's. So I'm getting paid for the whole process. And from my point of view, as I enjoy the whole process, that makes a lot of sense.
Well, that sounds like that's a good reason alone, right?
Yeah.
Rather than yeah, putting the money in someone else's pocket. I mean, I think you touched on where you get your inspiration from for your products. They're quite, they almost look like one-offs most of the time. How do you go about if someone asks you, if they said, "Oh, I really like that product I saw in someone's house. Where can I buy it?" Would you be able to make that again? I mean, apart from the downlights that you do, but I mean, I'm thinking of the spiral products. Is it possible to make them very similar or not the same, I guess?
They're never going to be entirely the same. And the shadow lights in particular are never going to be entirely the same because that is the most creative thing that I make. In as much as I start with no idea, I don't do drawings beforehand, and I kind of almost sketch in 3 dimensions with the wood as I'm making it. So I'll make up a whole load of spirals, and then start stretching them out and use clips to attach them to what will become the spine of the structure. And when it's all created a form that I'm happy with, then I start actually putting it all together and attaching it to itself. After which it will go into the base, and then the lighting element will be added to the top of that. So in that case, they are much more led by myself. But if you were to approach me and ask me and talk about it, and we would have a conversation, because that's how I've always worked with clients, is to have a conversation to make sure they get as much what they want as possible. We'll be talking about size. We'll be talking about examples that they particularly like. So the width of the wood that I use and to create the spirals from, they would have an input on. But essentially, the actual finished article, they would never entirely know until it was done. At which point, I guess they get a chance to say, "I don't like that," but that hasn't.
I hope not. I sincerely hope not. I think one of the interesting things about what you're saying is the material is really driving so much of the process. I mean, in our modern world of lighting, things such as LEDs have obviously changed the market a lot,
Yes.
and there's a lot of elements that are driven by LEDs, and a lot of, I suppose, when you're talking about light quality and longevity and obviously cost savings. So that does find its way into all of the catalogues and such like. But I noticed that you haven't mentioned the light source at all. I guess how does that feed into your general pattern, I suppose? Because actually LEDs they've changed a lot, haven't they? I mean, I guess
Yeah.
a perfect lamp light source for you would be a nice warm tungsten halogen or a nice, an incandescent source. But I guess things have changed so much.
It depends what it's going into. The warm LEDs now are lovely. Actually, as I'm sat here now, what's illuminating the background and myself, they're all warm LEDs, and it from what I've seen of the image myself, it looks pretty warm and pleasant. But the biggest difference for me and where they are so fantastic is the lack of heat they're giving off.
Absolutely.
So for working with wood, that's a gift. So all of my stuff's been tested before I've sent it off to be officially tested. And my pendant lights, for example, I had one of those running for 2 months constantly. And it was never even remotely warm, and certainly nowhere near hot enough to combust. And that's the same with the downlight bezels. I had those running for 2 months as well, attached to lamps. Just not enough heat to be an issue. They don't warp, they don't move. It doesn't affect the magnets that attach them to the downlight cover or that keep the caps on the pendants which allow you access to change the bulb inside. So that, if that hadn't happened, if we were still on halogen, I wouldn't be able to make what I'm making now.
Which is good because that's progress, isn't it?
Mm.
I mean, that, and you can see a benefit for that, an additional benefit. I mean, what leading on to that from that question? I mean, what are the biggest challenges that you've faced, and how have your products been received? Who are your customers, for example?
Designers who are looking for unique pieces for their clients as well. I've done a few shows so far, which has brought people to me. The website's out there. I am resentfully engaging with social media to promote my work because, as you can probably see from what I've been saying, that's not the world I come from. So it's not natural. I haven't spent the last 20 years in front of a computer screen.
But
Um,
it shows in your products. Let's face it. I mean, you couldn't create
yeah,
that on a computer screen, could you?
no, and I don't understand how that works at all. I've talked with some product designers recently who just come out of a product course at St. Martin's, I think it was. And I think at their end of year show, only one of them actually made the product they designed. All of the rest of them were presented, I guess, on SketchUp or whatever it was. And I don't understand how you can make something without knowing what the material does, because the failings in the material often lead the structural quality of it, the finished product.
Yeah, well, you're talking to someone who studied at Brunel, and we had to make everything. I mean, it was very much, and that was one of the biggest challenges actually, because you've only ever seen these things, I don't know, displayed and in the flesh, and when you actually have to work with it, it becomes a different story altogether, and you become really so much more appreciative of the craft skill that goes into it. Actually, one of the things I was going to say to you, I mean, yours is almost closer to the arts and crafts movement, isn't it? Of
Yeah.
the William Morris type affairs. That really is a circular economy, isn't it? We've come from a big, large production to something that is, I mean, it's also very close to art, I'd suggest. I mean, there's a fine line between art and what you're doing. So within light, I mean, you could even rename it as light art for something.
I've never been entirely sure what art is. And that's after a not inconsiderable amount of time sitting in an art college studying it. I genuinely just really enjoy the process of the designing and making. I love the fact that when I start on a project, I have no real idea of how it's going to end up. And it's the journey that you follow to get to that. And often the new skills that you learn along the way, which then go on to inform the next things that you make. And there's a very tangible sense of your progression through the process. So for me, yes, I owe a lot more to that era. But then the vast majority of my life has been spent pre computer. It's before we had all of these other options. And when I first started in the building game, it was before power or most handheld power tools, certainly well before battery power tools. When my greatest aspiration was a Yankee screwdriver, which is really completely redundant now, and you can pick them up for about £3. Whereas when I was first starting, it was a day's wage or more to buy one.
My gosh.
So that has to inform what I'm doing now, and it's a part of the life that I really enjoy. So it's not something I would ever willingly give up.
Not to put, I don't want to make out that your life is super cool and easy, but you are living a nirvana of design, I think. And I expect people listening to this would be envious of your ability to be able to create in such a almost natural way. I mean, it's almost it's not by osmosis, but it's something that just seems to flow from you rather than process driven. Yeah, I
Well,
think what probably if you had one last thing before we wrap up to to talk about with your products, how would you describe them to the man on the street, as it were? What would be your final word on the matter?
Oh, um, they're made with a lot of affection. I don't know whether it's love. That to me means something a little different, but I thoroughly enjoy the process, and I believe in my heart that if you show the care to the product, everybody sees that. And showing the care and wanting it to be as good as it possibly can be is it gives you something to shoot for. It gives you a reason to say no to something that's not enough and to try and make it better. And some clients won't ever see that. And other clients, it will be the reason they keep coming back.
Which is an amazing way to wrap up. So thanks very much, Matt. And thanks for
My
showing your
pleasure.
workshop behind. That's something to behold. So everyone who's watching, don't forget to share and like this podcast. And thank you thank you again, Matt, for your time today.
Absolutely
Right.
my pleasure, Chris. Thank you.